I think many beekeepers, especially if they don't have a few years under their belt, tend to forget that now is go time for 2021. I don't know about you all. I can't wait for 2021. I am ready for 2020 to end as soon as possible. And so, you know, I'm looking forward here to beginning to knuckle down and get our hives ready for 2021. And I hope you are too. And I'm starting with a photo from a beekeeper over in South Central Kentucky, over near Bowling Green. And he loves to wrap his hives. And so it just seemed to me like an appropriate image to begin our talk tonight with this. People seem to have many different opinions about wrapping hives. I will give you my opinion once we get into the talk, but here is an overview of the rest of the slides. If you nod off in the middle of the presentation, or I don't know, who knows, tree falls on your house in the middle of this and you miss it, you know, again, this is the time of year that you really need to get those hives ready. You need to get the winter clusters ready for what's in store for them in late November and December. And so if you haven't harvested your honey, of course, August, September is National Honey Month. So you want to go on and remove your surplus honey, if in fact you have any, keeping in mind that you need to leave about 60 pounds of honey, capped honey, to get your hive through the winter. And that's for each colony now. That's not for an entire apiary. You need 60 pounds at least per colony for the year. August is a great time to requeen, primarily because if the hive does not accept your new queen, you still have time remaining in September to get another queen in there. So some beekeepers are reticent to requeen in the fall. I happen to be a champion of it because I don't want my hives to go queenless come April and May, right in the middle of a honey flow or nectar flow. So I like to requeen, even though requeening in July and August means, of course, sometimes you haven't harvested your honey, so you have heavy wooden ware to move off or heavy supers. Of course, you have a lot more bees, so sometimes it can be difficult to find the queen. And always, of course, it's much hotter to requeen in July and August. But for me, the benefit in some ways outweighs all of those negatives because you don't want your hives going queenless in the middle of that great spring nectar flow. You won't get that spring nectar flow again. So for those of you who are serious, hardcore honey producers, this is the time to requeen. And you want to allow yourself enough time so that if your hive doesn't accept your new queen, that you can get another one in there and get her laying and get her accepted prior to wintertime. September, I'm typically trying to finish my Varroa mite treatments depending upon what that is. And this year, it's Apigard Thymol because we used Apivar last year. This is a good time to point out to beekeepers, there is serious concern that Varroa mites have developed resistance to Apivar. So you do need to change up your mite treatments every single year. You don't want to use the same mite treatment every single year. So Apivar tends to be a slower treatment. Just keep that in mind, that it needs, 54 days, I think. So that's roughly 2 months. So you need, if you're going to use Apivar, want to get it in Labor Day so that you can pull it out the last week of October. But it's slow. It will not give you a quick mite drop, but that's a little bit more technical maybe, and right now we're just talking about the calendar. I also start combining weaker colonies in September. Again, just trying to get those colonies acclimated to each other before colder temperatures hit. Want them to accept queens. And then by October, you know, I'm checking honey stores now. I want to make sure that each one of my hives has 60 pounds of honey, and I will equalize that if necessary. Keep in mind that small hive beetle traps, I'm sorry, I just now saw that I've made a typo there. That needs to be moved. SHB, small hive beetle traps, to the middle around your, what should now be your winter cluster is beginning to form, because small hive beetles stay with the hive through the winter time. They never leave. So I like to keep my traps inside the hive through the course of the winter, but I do move them around the cluster because that's where the beetles are. Beetles aren't stupid. They know where the warmth is. And so in order for the traps to be effective, they have to be around that winter cluster. And so I begin to do that in October. I begin to remove my empty supers and frames at that point in time. And then sometimes I will go ahead and treat with oxalic acid. Vaporizer method has been the treatment that my husband and I use during Thanksgiving week. But in order for that to be the most effective, it helps for the hive to be as completely brood free as possible. And so, you know, what we're trying to do is to wait until mid-December. But the point here is this: oxalic acid needs to be considered as a cleanup treatment. You don't want to be considering oxalic acid as your primary treatment for Varroa mites. You know, it says that on the directions. You know, you want to use it when there's very little to no brood in the hive. So in our climate, that typically tends to be the very last week of November or December, sometimes February. Husband and I will also add our quilt boxes. We use these instead of the hive wraps, but you always want to remember to provide some type of ventilation, because as those bees begin to consume that honey, they're going to throw off moisture. The hive has become basically a combustion machine as it converts that capped honey into food, into carbohydrates. And so both the moisture and the gases need a way to escape the interior of the hive. So make sure, regardless of what you do in terms of the exterior, you know, wraps, things like that, that you make sure that the hive has a way to ventilate. And once again, checking food. That's the constant in this. We're going to end the presentation by talking about nutrition. So,
hey, Tammy,
yep.
You did have a question about how many years between different types of treatments.
Every other year at least. You know, you want to shake things up a little bit. And I tend to forget that there is now another type of treatment that tends to work better in the wintertime, and that's HopGuard 3. That is now on the market. I'll just say this. In my opinion, I find HopGuard as a product to be very messy to work with, and so it's not my preferred treatment. I would much rather work with Thymol and Apivar and switch back and forth between them. But kind of keep in mind that there's another product out there. Also, keep in mind that this COVID virus has disrupted supply line chains. So you're going to need, if you're going to order these, for instance, from say Dadance, you're going to need to factor in at least 3 weeks in addition to what would be a normal delivery time for you. You know, I hope that's not the case, but I was just in Dadance and Kelly's this week, and they are just now getting caught up at Kelly's. And Dadance is still saying that they're 2 weeks behind, a week behind. So don't think that you can just wait right up until whenever it is, whatever date it is you have start on your calendar that you're going to treat, and give them a call and have them get that product to you quickly. Just keep in mind that everyone right now is dealing with a slower post office system, and they're also dealing with backed up orders. So I just say that as a cautionary point. And if you're going to decide that you want to try wrapping this year, Kelly's has this product in their catalog, but it's called a Bee Cozy, C-O-Z-Y. And I wanted to get that out there just in case you don't know that and you try to order it and you think I'm telling you the wrong thing. They have named it something else. It's called a Bee Wrap at Dadance. And so I've given you the model numbers there so that you can choose whichever one. And of course, obviously there are other bee supply companies out there, but given that I'm the state apiarist, I'm using these Kentucky bee supply companies as reference points. Keep in mind that as the temperatures get cooler, you do have animals that want to try to find their way inside a hive. A hive will stay at a consistent warm temperature, and that ends up being very attractive to mice. So entrance reducers need to be on your list of things to do. For larger animals such as a possum, which is what you have right there, and of course I'm from Harlan County, so I have to remember to put an O in front of the word possum, but there are skunks and raccoons, and if you see scratching on the front of your hives, then you know what's going on, and not just entrance reducers will keep them away. You've got to maybe take some more aggressive action. So carpet tacks are one way to do that. You can just get that strip and just nail it to the bottom board. Make sure that you put the tacks so that they are facing up. And when the animal puts its paws on that strip, then the tacks will make it uncomfortable for that animal to continue to bother the hive. Some beekeepers put chicken wire. They'll just take a roll of chicken wire and unroll it in front of their hives. And the idea is that skunks, raccoons, and possums, they don't like stepping on those unstable surfaces that chicken wire can provide. And so I mentioned these as two relatively inexpensive controls that you can do to kind of work with something larger than a mouse. You still need entrance reducers, but entrance reducers will not discourage these bigger animals. So you may need to take some more aggressive measures. And that includes setting out some traps. Sometimes elevating your hives is enough of a discouragement for these other, like I said, in my area, we call them varmints. That's probably not a technical term, but that's, like I said, elevating hives is another way of doing this, discouraging. And you can see, if you look closely at these particular hives, you can see carpet tacks have been nailed to the bottom boards there. And that does seem to work. And that's a good, thinking about that kind of control is a good thing to do, because you don't want these skunks scratching on the entrance or raccoons scratching on the entrance. It breaks apart the winter cluster. Those bees get angry, and if the temperatures drop, then your hive can freeze suddenly. So, think about doing what you can to deter those animals. And you can also see in front of this particular strip of hives, that they have put some type of netting down so that the raccoons won't step on it. Now, I did not think about putting a bear-proof fence in this presentation because it was already, in my opinion, getting a little long for an evening presentation. But bears, of course, are a reality where you live. And I have always said, and of course Shad can bear me out on this, that if you don't get your fence up prior to establishing your hives, and those bears find where your hives are, you will never get rid of those bears. I mean, they lock that location in their brains, and then you will always have a problem keeping bears away from them. So you're going to have to think about that. Although, of course, at this time, the time that we're talking about, October, November, December, bears should be in hibernation. So they should be less of an issue. If you haven't thought about putting a bear-proof fence up, you know, this fall may be the time, you know, for you to get that going. I think people have very different types of fences that they like. I have always found that electric fences for me are a little bit cumbersome. And so, you know, putting up cattle guards for me has been a little bit more effective, in part because I'm a woman. I can handle those a little bit more easier than I can with the electric fences. But you want to make sure to try to get them up before the bears find your location. That's the big key here, regardless of what fence it is that you go with. Otherwise, you'll always continue to have problems. So again, fall prep is about making sure that your hive has a queen, making sure that the brood is healthy. And that's what this particular slide is. You know, she's laying well. If you look at the bottom left-hand picture, for those of you beekeepers who may be a little newer to this particular endeavor, you want a queen. You want to see that she is laying one egg in the center of the cell. You don't want to see several eggs in the same cell. That would mean that you have a problem. You want to see that your larva is pearly white, and that would be the picture on the top right-hand side. If the larva is discolored in any way, your hive may have a disease. It's not incredibly common for hives to have disease in the fall, but they can. We have had in Kentucky quite a few cases of European foul brood this year, and you know, it's discolored larva is your sign. European foul brood is named because it does have a distinctive odor, which is not pleasant, and so that's another sign. But one of the things that you're looking for is to have, you know, good pearly white larva, and then you also want to see a healthy capped brood there, which is what you're seeing on the bottom right-hand side, where the cappings of your brood area are nice and rounded. And if they are sunken, or once again, if you notice a foul smell, that, and or if bees, you notice that bees have started puncturing the cells of the wax cappings, then that's a red flag. And there should be something in, you know, your beekeeper mind that says, uh-oh, I could have a problem here, and you need to do further investigation. You want to check this before the hive goes into wintertime, in part because if it does have a disease, you do not want to combine a weak hive with a diseased hive. Then you're just creating two sick hives, and neither one will make it. So checking for disease is always a constant, and especially at this time of year. You do want to combine weak colonies, but you don't want to combine them if one is sick. So we're going to launch into a discussion of Varroa mites because this is an ever-present challenge for beekeepers. You never get away from it. Varroa mites never take vacation, so as a beekeeper, you can't either. Varroa mite is an obligate pest. It parasite. It has to have a bee in some formation, whether it's the pupae underneath a wax capping, whether it's an adult bee, it's got to have that bee in order for it to live. Keep in mind that Varroa mites are blind. When I first started becoming a beekeeper, I guess I had this sense that Varroa mites were all powerful. They do have weaknesses, and one of those weaknesses is that they can't see where they go. So they have evolved a structure a little bit like a turtle, if you will. They evolved this kind of rounded carapace, if you will, and that helps them cling to either the pupae or the adult bee. And it also makes it very difficult for the sister bees to groom these Varroa mites off of the bee. Here's a better picture of what I mean by that rounded carapace. If you look at the top picture there, you can see it's first of all very smooth, so it's very difficult for a worker bee to be able to find a weakness in that armor to pull it off, to groom it off. And that allows that Varroa mite to attach very closely to the abdomen, the underbelly of the adult honeybee. There's been some studies that have actually counted where Varroa mites are on the bodies of adult bees. And most humans are looking to see mites on the backs of bees because that makes it easy for us, right? We don't want to be picking up honeybees with our bare hands and getting stung and turning them over. But in fact, almost 90% of Varroa mites are on the underbelly of the adult honeybees. And the reason why is because that carapace lets them slide in between those segments of their abdomen, and it makes them very difficult to find. So that's one phase of the Varroa mite's life. And again, it's blind, it can't see. So when it finally moves to the top of a bee, that means that the host that it's on, the bee that it's on, is getting weak, and it begins to put out its feet to try to find a new host. In that process, of course, is a very vulnerable time for a mite. It can't see, everything is inside the hive, it's dark. And so it's trying to find a new host. But sometimes the mite has also decided to reproduce. And so what it will do is put out those feet and try to find an open cell to drop into. And that is what you see in the bottom diagram. If you are looking to the left of that diagram, you can see a Varroa mite fall into an open cell and attach itself there to the larvae. And then the bees come along and they cap it, and the mite stays on that pupae and begins its reproductive cycle. And the Varroa mite will throw off a male mite to begin with, and then she will mate with that male mite, and that will produce a daughter mite. The male mite never leaves the cell. It will die there in the cell. But the mother mite, which and the daughter mite, will in fact leave the cell with the new young bee. And the whole time, of course, it is transferring viruses as it produces a mite wound on the bee larva, bee pupae that it is eating from. Here's a little bit of the technical language. I'm not going to get into talking about mites and claiming them as proto-nymphs and pseudo-nymphs and molting and things like that. I am happy to share this presentation with anyone who would like it after we are finished. But I suspect that if it's, 6 o'clock your all's times, it's a little late to get into talking about these, the technical terminology of what these mites are called and their generational differences. But because we do tend to have more time on our hands, I want to call your attention to Dr. Samuel Ramsey's new research. Many of us had kind of been trained to think that mites lived on the blood of bees. The hemolymph is the name of the blood that bees have. And in fact, Dr. Samuel Ramsey, who's a very young researcher, it kind of turned the research on its head. And what he learned is that Varroa mites, in fact, prefer what's called fat body. Now, that's a different entity than body fat, which many of us, of course, are very self-conscious about, and we get offended if somebody says, "Oh, you have a lot of body fat." that's not the same thing. But nurse bees especially have what is called fat body. It helps them produce nutrition for the very young, and mites in particular love nurse bees because that's where they like to feed. And so there's a very good talk that Dr. Samuel Ramsey does about his research, and it's just wonderful. And there is the YouTube channel there for you to watch it for free. It is about 10 to 15 minutes, so it's not a quick view. And while he does a good job, I think, of simplifying some of his research, for me, I had to watch it 3 times. The first time I sat through it, it does take some concentration. So just kind of FYI on that. And I mentioned that Varroa mites are not only damaging to honeybees because they create these mite wounds where they get their nutrition while they're in this reproductive phase underneath the wax cappings. They also end up kind of serving as hypodermic needles, and that phrase is not mine, but it serves as a good image because when they are feeding on bees, they are transferring these viruses that have been around for, millions of years. But what is changed has been, since Varroa mites have been part of U.S. beekeeping, all of a sudden these viruses, which have been around for millions of years, but were showing up in very low numbers. Beekeepers now are seeing deformed wing virus, all the time. It's not unusual. Or we're seeing Israeli acute bee paralysis virus. And so that points then to the nature of Varroa mites. They are the vector, but that's the fancy term that we use in science to say that they transfer these viruses. So a lot of beekeepers may not realize how Varroa mites spread. And, this time of year, especially if Shad and I were talking before this presentation started, here in the bluegrass, it's been very dry. And if a beekeeper leaves a hive open too long while they're doing a preliminary check, it is not unusual for robbing to start. And when robbing starts, mites can transfer very easily then. Remember, we said mites are blind. And so they start putting out their legs and trying to find another host to move from because they cannot see where their new host will be. So robbing becomes a real viable method of mite transfer, and especially the fall, as we try to, as humans, try to get our hives ready for the wintertime. Drifting, if you've got your hives too close together, this is a common problem in apiaries. You really want to have 4 to 5 feet between your colonies if you have the room. But my granddad was one of those where he had 10 hives on his timber frames. And so when you have drifting like that, that becomes a way of mites transferring between hives. Swarming is another way. That's not something that we typically tend to associate with the fall, but that is definitely a way. Swarms will bring Varroa mites with them. And of course, we beekeepers tend to also transfer mites without even knowing it. You know, we decide we're going to pick up our hives and we're going to move them to Florida, and then we're going to bring them back. Well, that's what, you know, we're also bringing back other things besides our bees. so that's something to just keep aware of. And I wanted to show a picture of Varroa mite damage. It's sometimes, I've already mentioned that bees will puncture a cell. They will create a hole in it. And that is one way that the hive has of what we call hygienic behavior, where it recognizes that the mite population under that capping is getting too big, and so they will try to arrest that development of both the pupae underneath and also the mite reproductive cycle. So if you see this, you don't smell anything, and look at the cappings, they're nice and rounded. So this isn't a sign of American foul brood, right? This is a sign of Varroa mite damage.
Hey,
and
Tammy,
then here's another sign.
There was a question about, can mites kill a bee before it emerges from the cell?
So sometimes what you can see, I don't know, I guess is the quick short answer. It can certainly pass viruses to a bee before it emerges. And then, you know, if the virus develops to a point that the bee can't develop, then the workers will go on and uncap it. And so you may see some, like what we call bald brood, for instance. You may see that in a hive where the worker bees have kind of stopped the development of pupae, and but there's still, and I want to be clear about this, there has been, to my knowledge, not nearly enough research done on that very question, and we need a lot more of it. Like, for instance, bald brood, I would love to see more studies done on that, and we just don't have it. Here are some more pictures of Varroa mite damage in particular, kind of getting at what the question is about. You know, can it be possible that the brood just doesn't develop underneath the wax capping once the mite load gets too high? And that's what you're seeing here. Viruses, I've already mentioned those, deformed wing virus there on your left. And since I've become a beekeeper in the past 20 years, researchers have now divided deformed wing virus into two different strains. It's not just one strain, it's two different. There's deformed wing virus A and deformed wing virus B. Israeli acute bee paralysis virus, of course, is the greasy bee syndrome there, where the fur is not present on the bee, so it can't bring back pollen, nor can it keep the brood warm. So these are the problems there. Beekeepers need to do at least one more what we call mite check. For me, the easiest way to sample for mites is with the easy checker there. I fill that up with rubbing alcohol. Some people will use windshield wiper fluid. That basket, which is what we're looking at the inside of on the left-hand side, should never have more than 9 mites. And the mite there is the red, maroonish red speck. And I think I quit counting at 30 on that particular sample. But you should never have more than 9, which ends up being not 3 mites to 100 bees, because you're taking a half cup of bees from the brood area. When you have done your mite count or your mite sample, then I like to recommend that people go to the Honeybee Health Coalition Varroa tool, which is right there, and you'll have 4 yes/no questions. And depending upon your answers, you will get different recommendations for treatments. And I just noticed that we're you know, right at the 6:40 mark. So I'm not going to go through all 4 of those questions for you, but this is a free tool for people to use. I'm on the board of the Honeybee Health Coalition, and we try to make all of our tools available for free. There is a best management practices for beekeeping there at the Honeybee Health Coalition, and that too is available to be downloaded for free. And it includes all kinds of information, such as winter preparation. So if you'd like more information, feel free to go there. Mite treatments, you just want to remember here that these can be toxic to humans in addition to mites. And so they do have labels, and we say all the time that the label is the law. And when you are using oxalic acid, it needs to be labeled as a miticide. If you're going down to your Ace Hardware and buying what they have on the shelf, and it's not, I mean, if it's used for as a bleach for woodenware, that's not a miticide. And it can impact your hives in ways that you may not appreciate. So, and when you call and complain, you know, that's the first thing that I ask is, are you using oxalic acid as a miticide? And if somebody says, well, no, it's I just got it off at Ace Hardware, then I have to stop the conversation then and there because, you know, you're using it in what we call off-label use. And so make sure whenever you are using anything as a miticide that it is labeled as a miticide and you follow those instructions. Because if you don't, there can be ramifications. And so I wanted to call your attention to the fact that, first of all, I take samples for the USDA Honeybee Health Survey. While we've got some downtime coming up in the wintertime, you can find these results, and that includes Virginia. I think it includes West Virginia. West Virginia just got a new state apiarist, and I'm assuming that she's a part of this sampling too. I also want to kind of give you a hint about how to use this. You click on the state for the results that you want, and then you go to the bottom underneath the map and you will see a timeline. So for instance, with this, I have the 2019 survey results clicked. And once you do that, then you can access the data such as Varroa mite counts. So Varroa mite counts for federal budget year 2019, you can see we're following national averages, especially in October. Remember, the threshold, if you look at that, if you look at the numbers on the very extreme left, it goes from 0 to 10 mites per 100 bees. The threshold is you should never have more than 3 mites per 100 bees. Well, we were in Kentucky, we were doing pretty well in February, March, April, May, June, July, right? We were staying under that 3 mites per 100 bees. But come August, which is normal, right? Mites begin to exponentially increase their populations as the hive begins to go into winter cluster. Well, we start inching up. And by September, we are double. We are 6 mites per 100 bees. Well, people, our hives are dead and they don't even know it yet. And there's just no other way to say it, right? By September, when they are that high, we're going to have winter losses. There's no two ways about it because those are your winter bees. And if the mite counts are that high in that part of the fall, we will have winter losses. And then come October, they're even higher. Well, so this is the time, the take home from this slide, folks, is that you've got to treat and you have to treat now. August is a good time to treat. We prefer it in July, but August will do just fine. What you don't want is to have what you see there in September and October and November. That's a real issue there. And so the viruses, of course, are hand in hand with that. Look at deformed wing virus strain B. I mean, you know, out of the 24 samples that I took last year across the state, you know, you have to take 6 samples per region, you know, at least 90% of them had deformed wing virus, right? And it's not as if the national levels are any lower. You know, we're kind of hand in hand there with the national levels. Nosema serrana, also high. We're right there with the national averages there. So I'm about to turn to Nosema next. But all of this you can find at the Bee Informed Partnership under state reports. You can find all of this information for your state. Nosema seems to kind of come and go. Unlike Varroa mites, it tends to primarily affect adult workers. You can send a sample here in Kentucky to Kentucky State University to Dr. Tom Webster, but you need to collect the older workers. And so one thing to do, if you've never collected for bees for a Nosema sample, is to go out at about 3 o'clock when all of your forager bees are coming home, stuff that entrance so that they can't get in, and then just pull about 30 to 40 bees off of the front of the hive. You will want to put them into a container that has a screw top lid, like a Gatorade bottle that's filled with rubbing alcohol, or soapy water or windshield wiper fluid. And you can send those bees into Kentucky State University, and Dr. Tom Webster will sample them for free to Kentucky beekeepers. Forever and a day, beekeepers would treat their hives in the fall with Fumagillin B. Fumagillin B was taken off the market, but Fumagillin B is now back on the market. Keep in mind, it is more expensive than Fumagillin B was. Fumagillin B was created in Canada. It was much closer. Fumagillin B is created in a South Korean company. So it's, you know, we're going to have issues trying to get it here in the States. But because it is more expensive, I recommend that folks definitely sample, know that you have a problem with Nosema. And here are the 2019 Nosema spore counts from the USDA Honeybee Health Survey. The other thing that you can do, it doesn't cost you, well, I guess it does cost you in terms of time and new equipment, but cull your old equipment. One way to reduce Nosema spores is to get your old beeswax out of your hives. Bees love building out on new foundation, and so of course this is something that you want to do in the spring, but also as you are beginning to prep your hives for the winter time, you know, you're pulling off that equipment that the bees are no longer using. This is a good time to cull your old equipment and beeswax. Small hive beetle, I mentioned, you know, they're going to stay right there around that winter cluster, staying as warm as they possibly can. We haven't had too much of an issue with small hive beetle here in the bluegrass in 2020, but I do like to show people some controls. This is one of our commercial beekeepers. His name is Richard Hosey. He creates what he calls a small hive beetle graveyard. And I'm not sure if you can see the arrow on your end, but the super that he has there, he puts skull and crossbones on so that he knows that that particular super, A, is not a beehive. B, it has diatomaceous earth inside it, and he puts a queen excluder over that. And when he finds a frame that's just has a ton of small hive beetles, then what he will do is bring that frame over there, and he takes a smoker and he'll drive those small hive beetles through that queen excluder. Just in case he's missed his queen, that queen excluder will stop the queen. He can pick her up, put her back on the frame, and he hasn't lost his queen in the process. So that is a time-consuming way to handle small hive beetles, but because he runs his bees to Florida, small hive beetles are something he does have to deal with, And this is a fairly cheap control. I like to remind folks about. There is another option. And while it is too late now to apply nematodes to your apiary, I like to get it on your radar screen because, again, we're prepping for 2021, right now. So you need to make a game plan for how the things you want to change, the things that worked well for you this year, but what are some new things to try? And so nematodes are, they are a control for small hive beetle. They will be consumed by the larvae of the small hive beetle. Now that's what you're seeing here. The small hive beetle pupae that are in the ground will eat these nematodes, which are native to North America, so you don't have to worry about any kind of invasive issues or anything like that. But that small hive beetle pupae will consume the nematodes that are in the ground, and then those nematodes will cause that small hive beetle to turn pink. And that way, that it is working. So for instance, on the picture on the left-hand side, this is a dead small hive beetle pupae that has eaten nematodes, and it has turned pink as a result. And so you can tell that this method of application is working. What you see here is to the left of that pink small hive beetle pupae is a healthy small hive beetle pupae. It has its original pearly color, so the nematodes haven't worked then. And what you see in the right-hand picture is we had a KSBA meet where we had Izzy Hill, who's the nation's expert in nematodes, come to Ashland and in Boyd County, and we applied nematodes to the apiary using, Chris Renfro was the president, just using a $5 watering can was how we applied nematodes. Didn't have to wear gloves, didn't have to wear safety goggles or anything else like you do with some of the other toxic chemicals. And if you want to consider that for 2021, this is a good source to reach out. There's also a great video of nematodes and how they work to control small hive beetles. If you choose to go this route for 2021, when you call this person, just make sure that he knows that you're a beekeeper. There are a lot of people who use nematodes for all kinds of controls, but just make sure that he knows that you're a beekeeper. And then finally, I'm going to kind of run through here some nutrition. This is really the most important part of winter prep, nutrition and numbers, because bee colonies, their survival, their generational longevity depends on both genetics and nutrition, not one or the other. It's both. And so going into wintertime, you need to kind of consider, first of all, having hives that have adequate numbers. I think many beekeepers, we don't want to make a hard choice. We caught a swarm in July and it's done pretty well, and we don't want to combine it with another hive. So it goes into the winter, and this is not my phrase, but it's like a hotel with too few staff. It doesn't have enough bees to do all of the jobs that a winter hive does. So you're first and foremost, you've got to make sure that your hive has 40,000 bees, right? And I'm using Kevin Hale's pictures with his permission because he's somebody who successfully overwinters nooks. And this is my sense of humor, all right? I just want to say, now, I don't want people to go out and think they have to buy pallets of sugar, but this is my strange sense of humor. But you may need to feed your bees. You may need to get them up to 60 pounds of honey to go into the wintertime. And I've broken it down here like this. Typically, getting ahead of myself here. Pollen becomes brood food, bee bread, royal jelly, and through the course of the year, you're going to need anywhere between 30 and 50 pounds of pollen, right? Just to have bee bread going into the wintertime can make a big difference, because bees consume bee bread more quickly than they do nectar. So, you know, just monitor that, I guess is what I'm trying to say. In terms of nectar, when a bee goes out and goes grocery shopping, you know, they're going to need 120 pounds of honey, but they'll need more nectar than that, because they have to, you know, get that moisture out of that nectar. So you got to kind of keep those in mind. 60 pounds of honey for the spring and summer, 60 pounds through the fall and winter. Many beekeepers don't realize, you know, how much water a hive will consume, but they need that water to produce royal jelly, to reliquefy the honey in the wintertime. And as they're reliquefying honey and consuming honey, you know, they need those carbohydrates to keep that winter cluster warm. They will be throwing off carbon dioxide, you know, so there's water in the hive. It's both needed, it's also being expressed, and typically that's about 27 pounds of water is needed for every 40 pounds of honey consumed. And then finally, when bees go grocery shopping, they're looking for tree rosin to form that antibacterial propolis envelope inside the hive. And right now it's sort of feeling like peanut butter. As it gets colder, of course, it's going to feel like concrete. But that's the grocery list for every single hive right now going into the winter time. And, you know, for some of these bees, it's kind of like when we went into the grocery store in March, and, well, there weren't any onions on the shelf, you know, and they're trying to substitute something else, you know. I mean, there's ideal pollens, there's ideal nectars, and if they can't get what it was initially on their list, then they're going to have to substitute for something else. But the other factor for successful winter management is enough bees. And forever and a day, I would hear people say, well, you need about a basketball size of bees to go through the winter. Well, you need more bees than that. You need more bees. And I like to remind people that you're going to need about 30 to 40,000 bees, because they will continue to decline as the winter progresses. And again, going into the winter with anything less it's a hotel with too few staff. And I think all of us have stayed at a hotel that has had too few staff to be able to deal with us clients as we you know, stay there. So this to me is a good picture. You've got bees on both sides of the frames, up in one colony up above, or a super up above and below. And there are many types of boardman or feeders. The boardman is that jar in the front of the hive. I dislike it for the winter. I dislike it for the summertime, for that matter. The glass freezes and breaks. It draws, you know, those varmints that we talked about earlier, possums, raccoons, things like that are messy, but especially in the wintertime to me. Bees are inside their winter cluster. They are not going to the front of the hives to get that sugar syrup, typically, or at least what I have found. I prefer interior feeders, such as the one here that Kevin Hale is providing. And you'll notice that he has also provided pollen supplements. And this is one of his hives in February. You know, notice the population there. Good population and plenty of room there. Another feeder that I do not recommend for the winter time is a division board feeder, such as what you see on the top. Again, bees are in winter cluster, typically in the center of the hive. They will not go to those division board feeders. Yep.
There was a question, and then I want to make a comment on that division board. I've had a lot of bees drowned in that particular kind of.
Sure. Yep, that's another problem with them. If you don't have something like a screen or a popcorn, you know, the packing popcorn, they can drown, definitely. So that's another disadvantage to division board feeders.
The question was what kind of water is best to use for feeding?
In terms of water, maybe distilled water. I'm never worried about the type of water. I may not understand the question.
He may ask or follow up with it, but I assume that it was whether it was city water.
Oh yeah, I'm never worried about that. I just like to make sure that they get fed. And you know, along those lines, I mean, I've always got a place where bees can get water, either a creek or something like that. Here on my back porch, I've got a bird feeder that I've converted by putting rocks, simple rocks in the bird feeder so that the bees don't like to get their feet wet, you know, and so I'll just, you know, pull tap water out and make sure that that stays full. We got Hurricane Karen coming through, so I guess she's going to keep it full for me. I'm not going to have to worry about that. Ziploc baggies can sometimes make a more convenient type of feeder for a beekeeper. Those big gallon baggies, but you can make a mess, and so I like to remind people to use maybe an empty super and put on top, and then put the baggie on top of the bees if you need to. Here is the consequence. If your bees run out of honey, which is their fuel, these bees have died with their heads in the cell, trying to get any drop of nectar whatsoever left behind to share with their sisters. And it will be completely silent. And when you see those tails in the cell right there, again, I am hoping that you see the arrow here. When you see that tail in the cell, you know, that typically is on you as a beekeeper. You have not monitored the food storage well enough, and that becomes a painful learning lesson. All right, folks, I'm wrapping it up. I know it's 7 o'clock and you're being patient with me. Here are the resources that I have quoted. And again, I'm happy to make this available to you if you email me afterwards. And of course, this is a little overkill for winter preparation, but this is one of my beekeepers in Berea. He did take that much straw and built himself a little fortress around his hive. And I hope we don't need that for 2021, but after 2020, I'm not making any promises. Maybe we need this around our houses too, but that's it. If you have any, like I said, if you'd like to have the presentation, just email me.
Tammy, I was going to follow up just real quick on the starvation thing. The one time that I've had that happen, they had plenty of honey.
Sure.
The bee cluster was just not big enough for them to break cluster and move around and get it.
Sure.
It gets back to the amount of bees that you referred to earlier.
Nutrition and numbers. Yep. That's exactly that tends to happen more than, you know, what should, but it's hard to know what the right numbers are when you're first learning beekeeping, you know. I mean, what is a basketball size of bees? Which is what everybody would say when I first started keeping bees.
Hey, Tammy.
Yeah.
Over the years, I've known several beekeepers who, most of them know about pollen patties and pollen substitutes, but very few feed those. Is that something as extension folks we should encourage to go in late January, early February to?
All right. Well, you asked. I'm going to tell you my opinion.
Okay.
There's a lot we don't know about those pollen supplements. There's a whole lot we don't know about the pollen supplements. We still don't know. I mean, one line of research right now that I think is quite compelling is, you know, are pollens a source of viruses? Along the lines of like the dirty doorknob, for instance. Are flowers a place where the bees are picking up viruses that are left behind by other viruses? You know, are the pollens themselves sources of viruses? But to come back to your question about pollen supplements, the people who push pollen supplements the most are people who are salespeople.
Right.
You know, there's a commission to be gained from it. And I'm not against it if, you know, I mean, if you can tell that that hive doesn't have any weight whatsoever, you know, then by all means, you know, get thee to the nearest bee supply company and buy those winter bee patties and, you know, get some weight on there. You don't want your bees to starve, you know, just simply because there's not enough research out there to support that. I'm not saying that. That to me is not a humane way to keep bees. But I do think that, you know, there's still so much to know and learn about nutrition. And that bee supplements are not an adequate substitution for naturally found pollen. You know, that the best, that the very best nutrition is the bee bread that the bees have brought in. And so that this is where, you know, if you've had a hive that hasn't done well through the summer, you know, you want to get in there quickly and freeze that bee bread that those bees have stored so that you can put that back into the hive in the wintertime. You know, that's what we do. But we also have well over 150 hives now. And you kind of have to get to a certain capacity to be able to do that.
Okay.
And if you only have like 10 hives or something like that, that's easier said than done. So bee pollen supplements are one way to take care of your hive. And don't neglect that just because, you know, the research isn't backing pollen supplements as much as we'd like for it to right now.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions, folks? All right. Great information, Tammy. You got a compliment there from Woody, and you did a good job. Thank you for coming on tonight.
Oh, sure.
Speaking to our folks. And this was recorded, and so I'll upload it to YouTube, and we share that on Facebook, so it'll probably see more people will see it, hopefully. So thank you.
All right. Very good.
Thank you.
Well, good to see you all.
All right. Y'all have a good evening.